on a long green island in the middle of an enchantingly blue sea. Fires glowed each night. In the midst of a crop of trees, chanting filled the air, accompanied by drums beating out a rhythmic dance. As the men of the island chanted and danced, a pod of porpoise would leap through the waves as if joining the men in the dance. The porpoise would twirl through the air and occasionally capture a glimpse of the men through the trees dancing. Now one day, one of the porpoise, a young female named Delathagouth, she decided she wanted to go up on the island to get a closer look at the men dancing. So she went up to her younger sister and said, "Come on, let us go on to the island and see those men dancing." Now, her younger sister was a bit nervous and excited by this idea. Delathagouth finally talked her into it. So that very night, as the fires glowed and the men started dancing, the drums were beating through the air, and the other porpoise were leaping through the waves, Delathagouth and her sister, they crept closer to the island, closer until they came to the shallows. And from the shallows, they leapt up onto the beach. And as they landed on the beach, the two of them slipped off their tails and they turned into young human women. The two of them took their tails and they dug in the sand and they buried those tails safely. And then the two, excited, quietly and quickly ran through the trees out to where the men were, but they stopped right at the edge of the firelight to hide in the shadows so they wouldn't be seen. And they watched as the men danced and chanted, and the two of them kind of swayed to the music of the drums. Now when the fire started to go out and the men started to wind down their dancing, the two of them, they ran back out of the trees and onto the beach, and they dug up their tails. And Delathagouth and her little sister, they slipped on the tails and they leapt into the water, and the moment they hit the salt water, boom, they turned back into porpoise. And they were so excited by this whole thing, the next night they went out again and they leaped out of the water onto the beach. And they slid off their tails and boom, they turned into young human women. And they dug holes and buried their tails. And then, giggling together, they ran quietly and quickly through the trees. And as the fire started up, they hid in the shadows. And as the men started to dance, the two of them started to dance themselves, having a grand old time there in the shadows. And as the night wound down, they went back through the trees, got their tails, leapt into the ocean, turned back to the porpoise, and went on home. Now one day, one young man of the island, his name was Akapekamekh. Akapekamekh was out by the beach and he was collecting palm toddy. And he noticed some strange marks in the sand that looked a little bit like footprints, but there was some strange dragging as well. And he wondered a little bit about it, but didn't think too deeply, and he went along his way. And that night, once again, Delathagouth and her sister leapt out of the water, removed their tails. Boom, they turned into young human women. They buried those tails, they ran through the trees, and at the edge of the firelight, they joined in with the men dancing, making sure that the men would never see them as they joined. And as the fire started to go out, the two ran back, put on their tails, leapt into the water, and boom, back to the porpoise selves. And that next day, Akapekamekh came out again to that same spot. And once again he saw those footprints and drag marks there in the sand, and now he wondered a little bit more, what is going on here? And this went on for several days in a row, the girls sneaking up on to the beach, turning into young humans, and Akapekamekh seeing those footmarks each day, and he figured there's got to be something going on because the ocean would be wiping away. So he grew very curious, and that very night, he snuck back to that spot where he saw the footprints, and he hid amongst a grove of trees. And he waited. And he watched as the fire started. And he heard as the men started to chant and dance, and then, to his amazement, he saw two porpoise leap out of the ocean. To his surprise, he watched as they slipped off their tails. And to his disbelief, he watched as they turned into young women. He saw them bury their tails. He saw them disappear through the trees. And Akapekamekh was stunned. And without thinking about it, he he stood up and he walked out of the trees and he walked over to the place where were the footprints. And he started to dig in the sand. And he pulled up one tail, Dilothaguth's tail. And he quickly rolled it up. And he ran back to his house. And at his house, he reached up into the rafters and he pulled down his basket where he stored all his special things. And he wrapped up the tail and he buried it deep inside that basket. And he put the basket back up the rafters and off he went back to the beach, into that grove of trees, and he waited all night, hearing the men dance. And as the fire started to dim, Akapekamek watched as the two young women came running back, and they went to the place on the beach where they had buried their tails. And the youngest sister, she dug up her tail quickly and slipped it on, turned back into a porpoise as she leapt into the salt water with Dilothaguth. Dilothaguth was digging in all sorts of spaces. She stood up and looked around, and frantically she was digging and digging and digging. And finally, Dilothaguth, she stood up and she looked out into the ocean, seeing her sister swim off. And Dilothaguth stepped into the salt water, but nothing happened. And Dilothaguth, she sat down and she started to cry. And Akapekamek, he stepped out from amongst the trees. Quietly, he walked over to where Dilothaguth was sitting. And quietly, he said, "Are you okay?" Dilothaguth, she kind of jerked in surprise and saw the man standing there, but she just kept crying. And Akapekamek, unsure what else to do, he sat down next to her and he said, What's wrong?" And Dilothaguth, she said, I lost my home. And Akapekamek, he thought for a moment, and then he said to her, You can come stay at my home. I can take care of you there." And Dilothaguth glanced in his direction and she nodded her head, not knowing what else to do. And Akapekamek and Dilothaguth, they walked together to Akapekamek's home. And each day Akapekamek would go out fishing or gathering the palm toddy, and in time Dilothaguth learned to tend the garden and gather the fruits and pound taro for their meals. And as time passed on, the memory of her home and her sister receded into her memory. Then she gave birth to a little boy. And Akapekamek fished, and Dilothaguth pounded taro and gathered the fruits, and soon she gave birth to a little girl. And one day, as things had gotten into regular routine and they had become a family, when Akapekamek set off to go fishing, Dilothaguth set up to create the meal for the day, looking for her taro pounder, but she couldn't find it anywhere around the house, and she searched all that she could, and so she climbed up in the rafters and she was going through the baskets there. And then she accidentally knocked over Akapekamek's basket. Now, she knew she was not supposed to be touching that one, and she saw it spill out on the ground, so she quickly lowered herself down into the home, and she started to pack up the basket. And then she saw this one strange little packet that had kind of broken partially open, and she could see something inside that was kind of decayed and a little ratty, and it was full of holes and looked like maybe rats had maybe chewed on it. But she recognized it nonetheless. It was her tail. And Dilothaguth, she opened up that package and couldn't believe what she was holding in her hands. So she grabbed her son and her daughter, and she quickly made it back to the beach where once she and her sister had such great fun arriving onto that island. And Dilothaguth took her decayed tail and she lowered it into the salt water, and it went back to the tail that she had once known. Dilothaguth, excited, she immediately started to put on the tail, kind of an excitement, rising inside of her. Then she saw her son and her daughter And she turned to the two of them and she said, I need to go home. I'm not from this place. Your mother is a porpoise. And I need to go visit my family. She said, I love you too so very much. And I want you to promise me one thing, that if anyone you see catches a porpoise, please let them go. Because that is your family. And with a kiss and a hug, Galapagos turned to put on her tail, and her two children watched as she leaped into the water. They stared as she turned into a porpoise. And Galapagos took one last leap up into the air, turned, glanced back at her children. She dived deep in the ocean and headed on home.